And what is going on, guys? Welcome to the Lore Reloaded. Now, as you know, this thing says that it's going live, but we all know that I am live, so I'm going to go ahead and let you know to check me out at twitter.com/Lore Reloaded, as well as twitch.tv/Lore Reloaded. Special treat for everyone today. I have Lisa Klink with me, who is one of the writers who was on both Voyager and DS9. I think it was just Voyager and DS9, right? Did you write any other Trek?
No, just Voyager and DS9.
Okay, yeah. So Lisa Klink with me. She wrote a couple of these episodes for Voyager and DS9, as well as was a story editor for a lot of the Voyager episodes. And one of the fun things is, first off, thank you so much for accepting. I'm really hyped about this. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because I don't know how invested you are or how much you get into like the fandom. But especially on YouTube, it can be very interesting because there's a lot of people who have a lot of opinions.
Sure.
They talk and they give what they think is happening. But when it comes to people actually in the industry coming and just talking and just hanging out and giving their opinions on stuff, it seems to lack that. You know, a lot of people who are apparently experts, but no one who actually worked in Star Trek. So for those who don't know, I actually did a video before where I'd asked Lisa some questions and she had taken some time out to answer, so that was pretty cool. And now we have her on so we can just have the conversation. A couple of the things that really wanted to get into was more looking at how you feel about both what you wrote and what has happened with your work. So I'm a huge fan of the theory of death of the author, right? So once you write something and you put it out there, it takes on a form of its own. It really becomes and stands for what it is, even if the original intent may not have been what you meant it to be. You put your soul into it, but it really becomes its own thing or own person.
I think that's especially true in television and film, because what you're writing, like a screenplay or a teleplay, is just a blueprint.
Right.
And then there need to be, directors and actors and costume designers and editors that all come in and add to it. And so my part of it is never going to be the finished whole, as opposed to novels where the written word is the end of it.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy, because I feel like the reason Star Trek, at least a lot of the original Star Trek, we'll just talk Discovery in a little bit, but the nostalgia track, the TNG, Voyager, DS9, it seems to appeal to a lot of people across the spectrum, from conservative to liberal, Republican, Democrat, and whatnot. And I think a lot of that is because of the way that it was written makes it very accessible. Even though I think that there is a good argument that there is a bias there or a leaning. I don't think anyone has ever really denied that. But I would love your opinion when it comes to that, because a lot of people these days would say that Star Trek has always been, left-leaning or liberal, or always had I don't want to say agenda, but a story to tell from a certain point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that I don't know that I believe it was done historically, like with Voyager, how it was done with Discovery. I feel like there was something there. There was a message, but it was told in a way that wasn't offensive, if that makes any sense.
Well, I hope so. I mean, or I hope it wasn't offensive. I think that all the Trek shows kind of stayed true to Gene Roddenberry's original vision for having it be about tolerance and acceptance of differences. And that it doesn't matter what kind of ears you have or what kind of language you speak or what planet you're from, that we're all essentially, more similar than different, even if, you're a Romulan or a Klingon or something. So I think that we've tried to stay consistent with that.
Right. Okay. So, and that was going to be my question for you. They said you're a little loud, so I'm going to lower your voice a little bit.
Okay.
So the intent was always to have a large swath to not necessarily preach, as it were, but to maybe just give a point of view or a side view. Was that the way you guys kind of looked at it when you wrote things?
Well, I think that, I mean, in a way, we're lucky in that the writers, and especially the lead writers, Jerry Taylor and Michael Piller, really believed in that vision. They weren't just trying to mimic somebody else, but that, we all, I think, genuinely embraced, yes, differences, can be strength. And we want to find the commonality between all of our characters, no matter what they look like or where they're from. And I think because we genuinely came from that place, it wasn't like trying to follow an order. It was the way we were naturally inclined.
Right. Well, and do you feel, just out of curiosity, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, but do you feel the same way about Discovery? Have you watched Discovery first? I
I
guess that would
have.
be a fair question. Do you feel they're going the same way, out of curiosity?
I think so. I mean, I think that their vision of Starfleet is again pretty consistent. That you can come from any kind of background, and if you're good, then you can make it in Starfleet.
Right.
Um, and I like that.
Do you feel the writing was and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to consider that for a second because it does feel different for me, but I wonder if they're writing to different audiences as well.
Well, Discovery is more of an action show. I mean, I think that they tend to go right out the conflicts, particularly with the Klingons. Whereas, again, original Trek and the few that followed it are more about peaceful exploration. And so we would get into character stories and sci-fi concepts more than space battles. Whereas Discovery seems to lean pretty heavily on the battles.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. Uh, and one of the things that I love again about the episodes and such is the stories that you write as well, and the messages. Let me ask you about specifically a couple of the shows that you had
Okay.
done. For instance, and I know we kind of talked about this beforehand, but one of my favorite disc, Voyager episodes is actually Sacred Ground, which did you write
Thank
that?
you.
How much?
I
How much?
did.
Okay. Yeah, let me ask you this because I'm curious. And apologize, there's a technical difficulty I'm working with at the same time. I need to hire someone to do all of this so I don't have to worry about it. Uh, did you go into it looking at making Janeway? Because I look at Janeway as a secular atheist figure in
Yes.
that instance. Did you do that on purpose? I mean, it may seem kind of obvious, but I've found sometimes people will write something in a way and they don't mean it to come out that way. Did you mean her to be a secular or atheist in that specific episode and the way she came out?
Yes. Yes, we did. I mean, we did talk about, what point of view we wanted Janeway to have. And we know that, she is a scientist. She came from a science background. And Starfleet is all about, again, sort of openness and tolerance rather than trying to push any particular religion. And so we thought that it made sense for her character to be more about facts and evidence than about things you can't explain.
Right. Well, I loved her approach. At the very beginning, she wasn't necessarily judgmental. And I think that there are some captains or some writing in series where we see a judgmental standpoint in Trek, but she wasn't judgmental. But the way she looked at it is she believes that they believe it was something mystical that happened, but there was always a scientific approach. And then I
Right.
love the tension and the hell that she puts herself through because she thought that's how religious people acted. She thought that's what a religious experience was and didn't really understand what being religious is. Do you think, at the end of that, out of curiosity, do you think she changed her perspective or she stayed pretty quote unquote scientific?
I think she might have broadened her point of view just a little bit, um, because could not explain it scientifically.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't mean it's unexplainable. It just means that with the tools and the technology that we have now, we could not explain it. And so I think it made her sort of crack open her mind a little bit more to say, yeah, there are still so many things out there that we don't understand.
Yeah, again, it was very well written, and I think DS9 and Voyager are the two I would say that I feel like gave a fair shake to religion.
Hmm.
I think the original series was of its time, and I think TNG was just completely unfair, generally completely unfair to how religion was done.
Mm.
And I don't mean to keep going back to this, but I really do. I find your opinion on Discovery curious. Do you think there was there was comparable stories that made you question like that one did in Discovery? Could you, and not to put you on the spot, but could you think of a storyline or an episode that would be comparable to that? I feel like this episode was very cerebral, and I don't know that I could think of I don't think I could find a Discovery. Not to say there isn't one. I don't know that I could find a Discovery equivalent yet. They could in season 3, to be fair.
I think that what Discovery tackles well is questions of identity, of how people see themselves, particularly a human who was raised by Vulcans, or the character Ash Tyler, who was actually turned out to be Klingon.
Right.
I think that giving those characters kind of inherent sort of dissociation in a way, that they have to kind of incorporate which am I? Am I more this? Am I more that? And how do I relate to other people in that way, I think is a very internal, and I guess it could be called cerebral, process, but I think that's also good character work.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. What was your favorite episode that you worked on, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, for Voyager?
Yeah. Or DS9. I know you.
It was probably Blood Fever. That was a lot of fun.
What did you enjoy about it? What made it fun? Just writing it, or?
Well, first of all, the idea of Paris and Torres. They hadn't really gotten together yet. There had been kind of flirting, and so to kind of ratchet that up was a bunch of fun. And I also really enjoyed toward the beginning of the episode when Vorik proposes to B'Elanna, coming up with what would a Vulcan marriage proposal be like. And it just seemed like there was, again, a lot of good character moments in there.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't disagree. It was really interesting to see the dynamics between the two, and it was, like you said, with Paris coming into his own and those two growing more together. So, yeah, let me ask you another piece too. So, and I'm looking at the comments while we're discussing as well, and something that comes up. Voyager, and we discussed this in email. Voyager, when it comes to continuity, in my opinion, and you may disagree with me, it started out decent, I think, for the most part. And then the further we got into seasons, and especially towards the end, I really feel like continuity-wise and cohesively, it kind of went off the rails, especially when you consider what was done with the Borg.
Yeah.
And I would love and I know we talked about it in email, but I'd love you to give your thoughts on it, because again, a lot of people have been commenting and asking about it. And so just what are your opinions? Because I would happen to agree with the fact that I think that season 7 Voyager probably took the loosest opinion when it came to continuity. I don't think it was cared about as much. Not to say that they didn't take a look at it, but kind of like you said before, if it is a good story, they're going to choose the story over continuity.
And I think that is true. I do believe that if given a choice of which one to sacrifice, you sacrifice the continuity for the sake of the story. Because I find that when I'm watching something just as a viewer, if there are continuity errors or like logic flaws or anything like that, if I notice it, if it really jumps out at me, that means I'm not engaged in the story.
Right.
Whereas if I'm really fully engaged in the story, then I might notice, oh yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't care because I'm into the story. And I think that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act. I would agree. You can break continuity to a degree as long as you can do it and keep them engaged. If you go too far one way or the other, then it'll break it, and people will just not enjoy it because, as you said, they're being pulled out of it.
Yeah.
How much? I looked at your IMDb, but how much involvement did you have with the Borg series specifically?
Well, I was there when 709 came on,
Right.
and so I wrote a couple of her earlier episodes, and it was great to introduce that character because she was so different. She was not Starfleet, and she was not, in a word, very polite.
Right.
She got to have some conflict, which is something that we specifically tried to avoid and were told to avoid with our Starfleet characters.
Yeah.
The theory being that humanity has evolved beyond petty conflict. But when you have somebody like Seven of Nine, who could be very blunt and really did not care about hurting people's feelings, that's an interesting character.
Right. And so that rule was still in effect by Voyager. I mean, I knew that was something Gene was really big on, and I
Yeah,
knew it had passed on to TNG. And the way they got around it on DS9 is they had a mixed crew. You had
yeah.
Bajorans and stuff like that. So in Voyager, you guys were given that specific directive as well. I didn't know that. I didn't know it had still gone
Oh,
that
yeah.
far.
Oh,
Huh.
yeah. It was still going.
You speaking of the Borg, you were a part of Omega Directive, where
Hmm.
really the Borg are to a degree given a religion. When it comes to that dialogue, and I know it was a long time ago, so if you don't remember the dialogue or specifically the interaction, was that something that you put together, or what was the decision to give the Borg a type of god or something they look up to?
Well, I think that the Borg have always been about achieving perfection. I mean, that, however badly they go about it, that is what they're reaching for.
Right.
Um, and I think that's always been true of them. And so to kind of put that front and center, not just to concentrate on, oh, they're assimilating everybody, but why,
Right.
I find interesting.
Okay. And you don't think it because when you look at TNG, they wanted to achieve perfection by assimilating everyone for all
Hmm.
intents and purposes. You don't think that, well, you wrote it, so I guess you wouldn't. The only thing antithetical to that, I'm not necessarily against it, but when I consider the Borg, it feels like religion from their point of view, not necessarily real world or what's true, but just from their point of view, would be somewhat antithetical because it feels like it moves away from perfection. But you think that in fact a search for God or having a higher power, I guess from a Christian standpoint, I could see that. I'm sorry, I'm trying to work it out in my mind as
Well,
well. I
also,
just,
if you think about like the hive mind is kind of the ultimate connection,
right.
and so in the skewed Borg universe, they're all equals. I
Okay.
mean, possibly except for the Queen, but that they are all looking out for the group welfare,
Right.
as opposed to their individual welfare, which you could interpret as being a kind of a religious maxim.
Sure. That makes sense, I guess. Let me ask you, I'd love your opinion on this because you wrote for it. Now, again, this gets what I do for a living is literally I watch sci-fi, but I'm known for Star Trek. I will watch a science fiction episode or series or a Star Trek episode or series, and then I literally like break down scene by scene what it means and then base it on all of the other series and stuff. It's one of the weirdest ways to make money, I'll grant, and it's one of the nerdiest ways to make money, I'll grant.
Yes, it is.
So I'm about to get really nerdy with you, and
Okay.
if you don't know or don't want to engage, just let me know. So in the next generation, the Borg have subspace fields, and effectively the way the fields work, as you probably know, is that the first shot you got full bore. So if you hit them with phasers, they took out a large chunk of that Borg cube, right?
Hmm.
But the subspace fields modulate so that that's going to be the only shot you got.
Hmm.
In Voyager, while we may have had some dialogue with subspace fields, it quite clearly moved to shields, and the
Hmm.
shields obviously work different than those subspace fields. I had a theory that I'd love your opinion on. Do you think that that may have been due to assimilation of alpha quadrant powers that utilize shields, and they found some use out of it? Or, and if this is too dorky, I know I feel like a insane nerd just asking this, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that since you wrote for the Borg.
Well, I think that that's a good interpretation that that the Borg just kept assimilating new technologies and more new technologies, and they would use whatever was most effective. So I think that makes sense.
Okay, I was just curious. Again, I know for writing purposes, shields work a lot better, especially when you're fighting a ship that should be able to get curb stomped by a Borg cube that you don't want
Hmm.
to use subspace fields. So I get that, but I was just kind of curious. We did have a specific question that keeps coming up. Uh, I'm supposed to ask you about the torpedo inventory log. I'm sure you've heard this over and over and over, but Voyager had something like 200 torpedoes or something like that, and
Hmm.
they go way over that when the dialogue says that they're not supposed to be able to, that they can't replenish it. What's your common answer to that? That was not me, by the way. That was just a common answer continued to be asked.
Well, I think that, I mean, unfortunately, the cheat we had to make with Voyager was that, or that I guess somebody chose to make with Voyager was that, we would lose, shuttlecraft like every other week. And
Right.
we would sure use up torpedoes and stuff like that, but that we would always be able to replicate more. And so, I mean, the one interpretation of stranding a ship out in the middle of the Delta Quadrant would be that we got sort of that we ran out of stuff
Right.
and that we would have to, go on adventures to like, acquire things like new torpedoes. But we did not choose to go that way. We chose to go more the we can just replicate a replacement, unless a story called for a particular thing that we couldn't replicate that we had to go get because that would give us story.
Right. Okay. Let me, and one more quick question, then we'll move on because there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Was it a decision made on purpose to have a basic reset at the beginning of every episode, generally, when it came to the ship's health? So, throughout the series and seasons, it feels like no matter what happens, the ship's going to be fine the next episode, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And generally, I think, in my opinion, when we see like an Enterprise's The Expanse, I think they did a little bit better job because if something hit the ship, it actually impacted it.
Mm-hmm.
So were you guys given a commandment on high that the ship had to be reset, or was that just like story purposes? Because I know a part of it was you couldn't have it's not like these days. You can't have a storyline that runs together. You have to assume
Right.
someone's coming in the middle of this so they can just plug and play whatever episode. So was it more like that, or
That
what was that
was
decision?
that was the approach that we were taking, is that people could watch these episodes out of order, or they could, miss an episode and still be able to follow what was going on. And so if we started the ship with, a big piece of junk hanging out of the hull or it cracked open or something, then we would have to assume that we'd have to catch people up because what if that was the first episode they ever watched?
Okay. Do you think that was the best idea for the time? Do you think that was appropriate, or do you wish you could have done something more like Babylon 5 or like we see with Discovery today?
That was just the nature of the beast. I mean, Next Generation Deep Space Nine had been syndicated, which means that they could very well get aired out of order.
Right.
And that was just the reality that we had to deal with. Voyager was aired in order initially, but of course, it reruns on every channel, all over the world. So I think that the decision was to make it more accessible. And I mean, it was a little frustrating to not be able to deal with, the consequences of one episode in the next episode. Unless they, we had a couple of runs where they had like two-parters, and when we would run into aliens again, we would reference past episodes.
Right. Well, the Year of
But
Hell was done really well,
yeah,
I thought.
yeah, like that. But there were a couple times where you would think that, if the characters had been through this in one episode, then they or their relationships might be affected in the next episode, and they really weren't so much.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. So let's get into DS9 a little bit and another episode that we had discussed. And taking a look specifically, you wrote Hippocratic Oath, right?
Yes.
I love Hippocratic Oath. Again, I think you're one of my favorite authors. I didn't realize it
Yeah.
until I started doing more research, and this is something I need to do on my side. But I love the way you write because it makes me think and it makes me question quite a few points of it. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
in Hippocratic Oath, let me pull it up here so I'm taking a look at it. What gave you the ideas behind Hippocratic Oath, out of curiosity, when you were trying to pull it together? What kind of inspired it?
Well, the path that it kind of went through was that I had been going in and pitching to Deep Space Nine, and kept pitched a few times and didn't sell anything. And then I pitched a story in which Bashir was taken to some nasty alien jail, and he had to basically become hardened in order to survive, and had to kind of violate his own Hippocratic Oath.
Right.
So then and that was about all they took from the pitch, and they said, okay, Bashir in jail, that's interesting. So then we started thinking about, what are some of the models that we think of when we think of, prison movies, things like Stalag 17 or, Escape from Alcatraz, and kind of talking in shorthand, are we going to lean more this way or lean more that way? and somebody brought up Bridge Over the River Kwai, um, which was not a prison movie, but it was prisoners of war. And we thought it would be really interesting to put our guys in kind of a similar position of being forced to work for the enemy.
Right.
And what would these two different characters, Bashir and O'Brien, who, although they're friends, are very different characters, what would their different points of view be toward helping the enemy, essentially?
Who, out of curiosity, who did you agree with more? Or was there someone, would you have said O'Brien had it right or Bashir had it right, out of curiosity?
Honestly, I really think that they both had points. I mean, I probably would have gone the Bashir route myself,
Sure.
but he was being very optimistic.
Yeah. Well, and so I did a breakdown of that episode recently being relative. And the more I looked at it and the more I analyzed, the less impressed with. I agree. I think Bashir is optimistic. He's idealistic.
Yeah.
But the less I agreed with him on so many different levels. I think it was intriguing to see the two and the differences that they came together with. I was there any reason, and I don't know that you wrote after that. I was trying to take a look to see if you wrote any episodes that was close to Hippocratic Oath. Was there
Not,
any,
no, that was the only Deep Space Nine that I wrote.
Okay, yeah, and that's what I was seeing right here. It didn't feel like that the issues between them went anywhere. Almost felt like a reset after that, and I didn't know
That
if there was
was
a
that
decision.
was one of the things that I had in mind when I said it. Sometimes it's frustrating that they don't have consequences
Yeah,
because that seemed like a pretty fundamental shift in their relationship.
right.
But just due to the syndication rules, we kind of had to hit reset.
Man, I bet it would have been excellent to see if they had told you to have them consistent and serialized, what you would have done with it. I think that would have been excellent. I get
Yeah,
why for that time it didn't. Now in a Netflix age, we really can, but
yeah.
I definitely understand when it comes to that. The other one that I don't have a lot that I want to say about it necessarily. Message in a Bottle. The really
Mm.
only reason I want to bring that up is because I love the Akira, and I wish it was a hero ship. And I think that was one of the best scenes, watching an Akira take on two Dodera Dex ships. But when it came to Message in a Bottle, what the only thing I could say is it almost felt like a stretch to get the Doctor all the way over there. Was there any discussion about that, about how to communicate or to continue to use? Because again, it was one of those things. It's like we find this object that allows us to, or this series of objects that allows us to talk to the Alpha Quadrant, and then we never really question it after that. Nothing ever really happens with it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it comes up in later episodes, but it just it felt like a stretch. Did it feel like a stretch when you guys were writing it, or did that not even
Well, I
come
think
up?
the way we justified it is that the ship that he basically transmitted to was unusually far out from Federation space.
Right.
And that was the only reason that we could communicate with that particular ship at that particular moment.
Why was it always the plan to have the Romulans try to take over one of the most powerful ships Starfleet had at the time?
Well, yeah, wouldn't you want
Well, yeah, I don't disagree, but
it?
I'm just saying, why the Romulans? Why not the Dominion? I mean, why not tie it into DS9? Why not use Dominion troops?
Well, we didn't really want to go over Deep Space Nine ground because we didn't want to interfere with whatever stories they were doing. You know, we didn't want to give them something else that they might have to refer to sometime.
Right.
And we thought that the Romulans, are intellectual kind of villains. I mean, they're not Klingons.
Right.
They're more you outsmart the Romulans, and that's the kind of villain that we wanted in that episode.
Okay. I was just curious if there was anything else to it, because when I took a look at it, and that makes sense, I just didn't know if it seemed like it would have been fun to try to tie DS9 and Voyager back together one more time, because you did at the beginning of Voyager. So I was curious what the choice was. And then again, with the reset where it doesn't impact Voyager or DS9, that the Romulans tried to take the most powerful ship at the time. But again, I guess it's just the status quo. Starfleet expects the Romulans to do something like that. So
I think
it was a
that's sort
day
of the
that
way we
ended in
thought about
Y.
it is that, yeah, they're gonna try and get up to something if they can.
Right.
And that's just who they are.
Right. It was a day that ended in Y for Starfleet, intelligence when they see that the Romulans attempted something. So
Yes.
here's where it gets a little bit interesting, because I wanted to discuss Discovery versus basically. So I look at Trek in three different eras. I see the nostalgia era, which for me is TOS, TNG, Voyager, DS9, and Enterprise. You have the J.J. Abrams era, the movies. I include the movies. I include the non-JJ movies with that era, with the nostalgia era, and then you have the JJ verse movies, and then you have Discovery on. I think that a huge reason these eras are distinct is because of the camera style and the writing, because they happen in different, with different audiences. So it's kind of disparate. I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for, but it's very, there's a lot of contrast there.
Yeah, the voices are kind of different.
Yeah. And they have to be for the audiences. A lot of people get upset, I think, about with Discovery because it's not written like TNG, right? But I don't think audiences today would enjoy The Next Generation. I could be wrong. I just don't think they would. I think the audiences are looking for something different, a different voice.
Well, I think that something that I think you might be right, because audiences have become sort of habituated to the flawed hero and the more complicated characters, the anti-heroes. And so I think that they are looking for a little more depth and complexity.
Right. Yeah, and more gray, I think. I think in TNG, even DS9 and Voyager, there was less of a delineation. There was good and there was bad. Now, there was some gray in DS9 and Voyager especially, but not what we see in Discovery. Because I think that's what people want. One of the things I feel, and I would love your feedback on this, because one of the things, again, I looked in your IMDb, and I contacted you via your Twitter, I think is the first way we met. Yeah. And it's just kind of interesting. I mean, we're not too far off, but you and I would probably disagree politically on a couple of things. And this is why I would love your feedback, because the channel is a conversation. I want everyone who has a different opinion to talk about it. You stated that you feel like Discovery is similar to what we saw with Nostalgia Trek, with TNG, DS9, Voyager. I personally feel like, whether I agree with the message Discovery is doing or not, it's not even about whether I agree with it or not. I feel like Discovery amps it up to 11 and doesn't try to do something that everyone can enjoy, but sometimes writes it in a way that they're specifically attacking an ideal or an idea or an ideology.
I don't know if they're attacking it as much as they are questioning it. Which just to take a closer look of, what does this mean exactly?
Sure.
What does loyalty mean exactly, and who do you owe it to?
Well, let me give you an example, and and again, if we want to move past this, we can. But first, I'm gonna start this out with I'm not really a huge fan of our current president or anything like that. I'm not. But when you look at, and you said you've seen all of Discovery, so I assume you saw the Mirror Universe episodes. So in the Mirror Universe episode, we have someone who is supposed to, as far as I can tell, mimic the current U.S. president with the "Make the Empire Great Again" and all that stuff. But he does it so much that it makes it parody and almost makes it seem like it's easier to fight against it. It seems like it's so in your face and so ridiculous that it not only divides the fan base, but it turns the person they're trying to say is bad into a parody to make it easier to sympathize with them. And let me try to give you why I think that, right? So you have Lorca, who wants to make the Empire great again. He's fighting against the Empress, who and he's fighting at the Empress because a part of it is like he feels like she's not as tough on aliens as she could be. She destroyed the Klingon homeworld. She literally eats aliens as just a part of grand meals and stuff like that. So what exactly, however bad Trump is, I don't, well, at the time it came out, let's put it there too, I don't know that we had comparable stuff to it. And I think it unnecessarily divided the fan base, and it made him a parody so that it could just easily be countered. You see what I'm saying? And if you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to. We can move on. Just let me know. But I'd
Well,
love
I
your
think that
feeling.
clearly they were looking to do something different with their characters. I mean, obviously they were steering away from the, oh, humans are getting so evolved in the future.
Right.
When you have a character like Lorca. And I think that I think, again, I wasn't involved in any of the decision making with this. And so all I
Sure.
could do is kind of look from the outside. But I think that, again, they were looking more at his story function,
Right.
that not so much getting into the depth of his character, but how do the other characters kind of reflect off of him in a way? How do other characters react to him, and to the shock and to the betrayal? And so I think that to accomplish all of that, I think they needed to make him a fairly extreme character.
Okay. Okay. I was just curious on your opinion because again, when I started watching Discovery, I wasn't a huge fan of it at the beginning. It was really pulling me in, and then I just felt like it just unnecessarily divided the fan base, and it was just a parody when there are a lot of reasons to counter a lot of what the president has done. I
Mhm.
just I want to make sure it's done in a smart way so that it can't just be disregarded, and that's the only reason I asked.
Well, the thing is, in the mirror universe, everything is extreme. I mean,
Sure.
it's, everything has to get cranked up to 11.
Right.
Um, I mean, I personally think that they went to the mirror universe too soon in the run of Discovery. I think that they should have let us kind of get to know the Alpha universe characters much
Right.
better so that we would see the difference, more starkly in the mirror universe. But since they did go there, again, they had to run with it.
Right. I don't disagree with that, though. I will say some of the best subtle writing for Discovery was done with the mirror universe. How the light looks different,
Hmm.
or feels different, or it's dimmer even there, and then they pull that in as a part of the issues they had. I would say that I think that I don't know. I don't know a lot. I haven't looked at the ratings there, so I can't say the impacts of it. It's really hard the way CBS does it too. I don't know who or what to believe when it comes to how
Yeah,
popular they are.
yeah.
That does bring up an interesting thing, though. I think a part of it too. A lot of the reasons people don't like Discovery is because of how public the cast and some of the crew have been politically, and
Hmm.
just given how divided our culture is. If you say you support something, you're going to make enemies because unfortunately that's just how we are right now.
Yeah.
I don't ever remember Voyager cast and crew being like that. Well, did that ever occur? Was there ever really stances that the cast and crew took
Uh,
in that? And if
not that I
not, how do you
recall.
feel? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Not that I recall. I mean, I don't remember there ever being, discussions in the office about what are we going to do about so and so. I don't recall that now.
Sure. How do you feel about that? That may be kind of a question. I don't know.
About actors coming out and stating their political stances.
Well, not necessarily actors stating individually, because they didn't just do it individually. They stood up as like the Voyager cast or the Voyager, the Voyager cast and crew saying we support X. They at least did it once that I'm aware of.
You mean the Discovery crew?
Yeah, Discovery crew. I'm sorry. Yeah, but they did as represented. Well, I mean, they probably weren't official, but they stood up and said we are Discovery, and we support X. Right? Do you think when it comes to like that, would you agree with that or not? I mean, that is a question I can understand if you don't want to answer.
Well, I think that when you are representing a show,
Hmm.
you do need to consider the consequences a little bit more than when you're representing yourself.
Right.
um, because there are a lot of people, other people who work on that show, and who are going to have to sort of deal with, the fallout from whatever it is that you say officially.
Right.
So I think that that's probably not the smartest approach.
Okay, I was just curious, but I would agree. I think that individually in things, I don't think people should be held necessarily to a standard. I mean, it depends on what they say, obviously, but generally, someone's political affiliation, if they're just on their Twitter talking of their own, I don't think it should be tied necessarily. As Chris B319 says, Kate Mulgrew is very politically active currently, and
Hmm.
which I know, I followed and talked to her, and I think I don't think that should be reflective necessarily of what we see on Voyager, or should be assigned completely to Voyager. Do you last question when it comes to that, and I think then we can go into some questions or whatever you want to talk about. But just out of a curiosity, do you think do you think Discovery, do you find Discovery to be divisive? Let me start there.
think within the fan base, I think there are a lot of things that are divisive.
Right.
I mean, there's strong opinions about a lot of different things, including Deep Space Nine and Voyager and different characters. I don't know that I would say that Discovery is more divisive than other issues.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about that because again, the world in which I live in, a lot of it. I mean, I've moved out of it to a degree, but when you go on YouTube, and again, I don't know how much you get on YouTube, but you have channels that are just dedicated to talking about how, Discovery is trying to like just make everybody a leftist or just destroy the right or things like that, or just very very dealing in absolutes. And so it's interesting to see someone who's been a part of that culture and in the industry to get their feedback to it again, just because so many loud voices,
I think there have always been loud voices, honestly. I think that with the advent of social media, it's just given people more of an audience and sort of put a megaphone in their hands. But I bet that there were just as ferocious battles about the original series, but we just didn't hear about them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I've thought about that too because I've done a little bit of research. So one of the things when it comes to the channels, when I first started out, I was pretty abrasive because not only did it get views, but it was just how I critiqued things. And so as I've gotten more mature and started watching things more and comparing things, and even gotten into the film industry to the limited degree I have, I've taken a step back and seen the flaws in that, the mentality I had. But it's really intriguing to see. And I did do research on like TOS and DS9, and you would have people who would be as vitriolic. I don't know. Did you see the DS9? I don't documentary. That's the word I was looking for. Sorry. Did you see the DS9 documentary?
I haven't yet.
Okay. Yeah, they were talking about some of the feedback they got, and it's just as bad as anything you'd see on Discovery, which
Yep.
is kind of crazy to see. But
I think those people have always been there. It's just
right.
that now we can hear them.
And it's, as you said, it's amplified to a degree because not only can they yell it to the masses with Twitter or Facebook or whatnot, but they can find each other, and then their voice can be amplified by the numbers that
Yeah.
they have. So, all right, yeah. So let's go to the questions real quick because I know you
Yeah.
wanted to get the questions and everything,
hmm
and a lot of these are more the Trekkie questions you expect, not necessarily what we went into. And then, of course, if there's anything you want to talk about or anything you want to go into, or anything you think about that you want them to know about. But here's the questions we go. So please ask Miss Klink if there was something she wanted to write for Voyager that she didn't get to write. So was there a story or was there an aspect that you weren't able to do because you were stopped or just didn't have the time or didn't get the ability?
The only thing that occurs to me is when Roxanne Dawson got pregnant. I had all these ideas about how we were going to tell the story with B'Elanna being pregnant,
Right.
and how we could incorporate that into the show, and kept getting shot down. We just put her in loose jackets and hid it.
Yeah.
So I think that might have been kind of fun.
So and you just didn't really get to expand on it, kind of like you wanted to. Did you write the episode that involved the Klingons?
No,
With okay, where the baby saved the day or something with its genes exactly.
no.
Yeah. So okay, interesting. Was
That's the
there
only
any,
one that occurs to me, because generally it was pretty open. I mean, if you pitch it, most of the time they would do it.
so it wasn't so it was pretty laid back. They really were open to ideas and things.
Absolutely, it was really not hierarchical in that everybody's idea was kind of given equal weight, and the best idea won. It didn't matter what your job title was or how much you made or how long you've been writing for the show. It was really about the meritocracy of, is that the best idea?
That's awesome. Do you
Yes,
know
it
if
was.
was that consistent in DS9? Do you know?
I believe so, yes.
Huh.
I mean, again, I wasn't in their room as often as I was in Voyager, but I certainly got that impression.
You see, that is so different to things I've read and seen in interviews when it comes to Rick Berman, who one of the things that I love and hate about Rick Berman from the research I've done on him is I think that he really wanted to keep everything as close to Gene's ideal that he could.
Yes, he did.
And you know, at first I really didn't like it because I felt like he took Star Trek in a wrong direction. But then I researched what he was doing and why he was doing it, and I really respect that aspect of him. I think that's awesome. But from what I've heard and what I've seen, that was a limiter because he was always about Gene's ideal. So you didn't feel like that necessarily was a problem.
Well, sometimes it got in the way of some stories in that, drama is conflict. And if you're not allowed to have conflict between your main characters, that does feel a little bit like handcuffs. Um, but, you know, to keep the voice consistent and to stay consistent with the vision that has worked for a really long time, you kind of have to be willing to give in one area to succeed in another.
Right. Well, and I think I don't know that it always worked, in my opinion, but I don't necessarily want to argue that. I think it's very neat and cool that Rick was as dedicated. It
Yeah.
says a lot about his character that he wanted to keep it that way, which was again something admirable, I think.
I think that's admirable too, because a lot of people, if they come in and take over a show, they want to put their own personal stamp on it.
Right.
And they want it to sound like them. But Rick always wanted it to sound like Gene.
Right. Which again, yeah. So that's interesting. I like that. I'm glad we have these conversations, even though I feel like this is a horrible interview on my side that I'm doing horrible. I've learned a lot from this. I'm glad. We got to do this more.
Okay.
You kind of answered this to a degree, but was there any creative story ideas you never got to implement? Not necessarily was held back, but you never got to do for one reason or the other. Anything you would have changed had you been able to be in the room all the time?
Nothing that really occurs to me. Like I said, we kind of knew going in that it was episodic, not arcs.
Right.
And so anything had to be told within an hour, and just within that limitation, of course, there's a lot of stories you can't tell, but nothing specific that I really was dying to do.
Gotcha. Okay. This one doesn't make it. Why no firearms? Our weapons are primitive and they could replace them easily. Why no firearms? Because they had phasers, which work a lot better than I would assume firearms in the 21st century. Which is
Yes.
why they never use that. Maybe you could argue with the Borg, but even then we could talk about armor and stuff like that. So I guess that's where we're going to go with that one. So season 5, episode 1, Night, because you instantly remember all of the episodes, I'm sure.
Sure.
Why did they make it so that everyone was fine after such a mental strain, being in complete nothingness for 2 years? I can look up what Night was if you need to. I don't know if you worked on Night either. Do you remember?
No, I wasn't there anymore.
Okay. So you couldn't even speak to that because that wasn't something that you wrote on. I
No,
don't know.
but I think it's kind of the same answer, and just we had to hit the reset button. We just did, and that was a given going into it.
Right. What's the favorite episode you ever wrote when it comes to Star Trek? I think you've given that once, but what was the one you really stand behind?
Well, Blood Fever is certainly one of them, and also Innocence I liked a lot, where Tuvok was trapped on a planet with a bunch of children.
Yeah, and I'd point that as something we might have talked about. Why exactly did you really enjoy Innocence? What about it kind of pulled you to it?
Well, because we had said that Tuvok has kids back home,
Right.
it kind of gave me the interesting idea of what are Vulcans like as parents? Because that is inherently such an emotional thing to do, and it's such little kids are not born logical, you know, and love has to be part of it. And so, how do Vulcans go about this? And watching Tuvok act with these little kids, presumably, would show us how he would act with his own kids, and I found that interesting.
Let me ask you this, because I find it. One of the things I do find very curious in that is at the ending, he just takes their word for it that that's how everything works out. That's how their entire evolution goes through.
Hmm.
If I remember the episode correctly, he never really verifies.
Well, how would he?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think you could still ask more questions, or you could press them for more evidence on their ship. Or I don't know. It almost feels eerie that he just takes their word for it and leaves. So do you think that really wasn't as huge an issue
I don't,
when looking at it?
because he did go with the little girl into the cave and would have seen her basically disintegrate.
Okay. Yeah, I
And
guess I didn't
so
think about
with his
that.
own eyes, I mean, he sees, well, this is what happens. You know, whether they could stop it or, what this culture is about, is another whole can of worms. But I don't think he had any reason to doubt that what they were saying was true.
Okay. Are you an Orville fan?
I'm sorry?
Are you an Orville fan? Have you ever watched Orville? Do you like it?
No, the Orville, yes, I have sometimes.
Do you enjoy it or not really?
I mostly enjoy it. Sometimes I find it a little too snarky. I mean, I like snark as much as anybody, but it seems like they're sometimes trying to have it both ways, to be both idealistic and cynical. And sometimes that balance doesn't quite work for me.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Here's an interesting question. We kind of discussed it. Do you think we've moved past have the times moved on past Star Trek? Has Star Trek really done its run, or do you think there's more stories to tell?
I think that the universe is interesting enough. I mean, the Star Trek universe has enough unexplored corners in it that I don't think that we've run out of stories to tell.
Okay. Yeah, I've often wondered. I think that a series or season or anything does have a natural ending to it. It's just how long can you go before all the stories have been told? And I'm not saying that's Star Trek, but it's I think it's an interesting question.
Oh yeah, no, series do have lifespans, definitely. How much can you explore this one character and have them deal with their central issue again and again?
Right.
But in terms of different Star Trek series, and just telling stories from different points of view and different crews, I think there's a lot of room left.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially where Discovery and Picard are going now. I think
Hmm.
it's really interesting. I'm about done with prequels personally, and I
Well,
think it causes
sure.
a lot of problems. But personally, I think it's really interesting. I think. Uh, Here's one that kind of relates back to Voyager. What do you think about one of the best episodes, in their opinion, with the Enterprise, Damage, season 3, episode 19, where Archer becomes a pirate and takes a necessary part for his ship that leaves it stranded? Do you remember that? Because I know you said you watched Enterprise. Do you remember that episode specifically?
I don't really.
Okay.
I mean, I watched most of Enterprise, but not every single one.
Sure. So I'll give you the situation. You give me your opinion. Effectively, they're in the Expanse. It's going through that series arc, and they, for one reason or another, need a specific piece or part to go back to warp. They're left
Hmm.
stranded. They come upon a ship that has that part, and the ship, from what they can tell, is close to its home. Without warp, it takes like 6 months for it to get home.
Hmm.
So they have to save Earth. So what they do is they beam aboard, they steal the piece, they leave enough munitions and food and stuff so that they can make it back home, and then they go about their merry way. And it's not something Archer enjoys. There's a lot of drama to it. It's not as go lucky as I'm making it out to be.
Hmm.
He has a huge issue with it. But when it comes to story writing like that, what were your thoughts? I can't remember if Voyager ever did something similar. Maybe they did, but
Well, I think that, I mean, those are the interesting issues to explore, and you want to, as often as possible, you want to back your hero into a corner that there is no good way out of.
right.
And you think, between this bad option and that bad option, which is the least bad? And I think that the more difficult you can make a decision, the better.
Right. Yeah, I think again there was a lot in Voyager that did that as well. It's one of the reasons I just love Nostalgia Trek. It honestly makes me question, and some of the episodes in there really changed my point of view. One of the things I love, and um, you see it in Discovery, but not as much. But the normalization of things that, for whatever reason, aren't normalized here in this day and age. like
Mm-hmm.
in DS9 when they looked at homosexuality or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like huge fanfare or anything necessarily, or it didn't feel like it to me. It was, this is normal and this is something that occurs and everybody's okay with it because it's just
Yes.
what happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things I just love, and it really impacted me because I was in a very Christian household,
Mm.
very Christian household. So it was something that was impactful to me, the normalization, and I love that about Star Trek. So
And that's something that I appreciated about Voyager is that we did not make a fuss about having a female captain because at the time it would be no big deal.
right, yeah, and it's it's an interesting piece. Again, Star Trek has a good way generally of just having things normalized and something that isn't just isn't questioned. It doesn't have to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And the fact that she was, let me, here's an interesting question for you that I always thought. So I Chakotay, of course, was a part of the Maquis and everything, but
Hmm.
I think it would have been curious. It feels like they could have had a lot of good drama if they had Janeway, like she was, a science officer, very a veteran, very cultured and such, and Chakotay, who had more command experience or more strategic experience, and
Hmm.
have those two almost fight for the captain slot. Both having strength in different areas, and maybe
Hmm.
make that season one. What are your thoughts on that? Because it didn't feel like Chakotay just fell in line, and I think it
Yeah.
might have been more interesting if both of them kind of went at it until there was a mutual understanding and something they both uh, came to respect each other.
Well, I think that again, this is one of the consequences of in the future people are evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could not have a major storyline in which our characters were directly pitted against each other.
Why? Okay,
I mean,
that
that's
just
that's why I mean, the Maquis are supposed to be this, this kind of rebel force, and they all kind of fell in line really quickly
right.
because in the future, once you find yourself in a situation, you make the best of it and you do your job.
But that was the whole plan, right? The entire creation of the Maquis was for Voyager,
Yep.
if I remember correctly. And
Yep.
so it was the reason why it was in TNG and it was in DS9, and they somewhat, in some instances, shoved into episodes, was to make this dynamic, and then you just ignore it. I mean, they're
And
not
then we
even
just dropped it.
Starfleet.
Yep.
They're not even Starfleet technically, so you could, but I guess they are human. I So let me ask you this, because DS9 kind of bucked that to a
Hmm.
degree. O'Brien tried to commit suicide in one of the
Hmm.
episodes. Uh, how do you feel about DS9 being able just to say, we're going to do some things that weren't allowed? Do you think Voyager should have done that, or do you think DS9 was in the wrong for doing it?
I don't think DS9 was in the wrong. I mean, I think that again, telling story, drama is conflict, and so telling stories that have more conflict, I think is not a bad thing. I think that because Deep Space Nine went there, we didn't want to make Voyager just a copy of it. I think that Voyager was more modeled on Next Generation, because we ran first, a couple of years at the same simultaneously with Deep Space Nine, and so we didn't want to just, be a kind of a pale copy of it.
Right. So you think that not necessarily doing the same timelines, but being, I'm going to say edgy for lack of a better word. I don't know that it
Yeah,
would be, but being edgy like that would have reminded people too much of DS9, made it think it was a copy of it. Because,
I think it might have.
okay. All right. And so one of the last questions we have for you, too, do you play Star Trek Online at all? Are you a gamer?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So you don't know anything about their storylines?
No.
Okay, because one of the questions was what were your thoughts and where they're going. It seems like from everything we are getting that Star Trek Picard and the writers for the Star Trek Online game have synced up, and they
Hmm.
are writing storylines that are similar because it looks like they're pulling it directly from Star Trek Online in some instances. So I didn't know how much you knew about that or if you'd be interested in it. So fair enough. Not that big of a gamer. What's up with that? We need to get you into gaming. That's what I've learned from it.
I already have plenty of time, plenty of ways to waste my time.
Fair enough. Well, so is there anything else we have about 80 to 90, almost 100 people. When it comes to Star Trek or anything in particular, is there anything you want to kind of leave them with, or anything when it comes? I'll tell you this. I'm pretty critical of Star Trek Discovery. When it comes to continuity, canon, things like that, I don't feel like it sticks to it. I think they do more go the story way. And because a lot of my channel has been based on alpha canon or continuity and what's come before, I can be pretty critical. So that would draw a crowd that generally is not the hugest fan, at least when it comes to continuity of Discovery.
Right.
So you probably have a lot of people who are, I think they could probably enjoy it, but are critical of it. Is there anything you'd want to leave them with, or anything you'd say? Because I'm sure, to your point, it was maybe similar with Voyager. When Voyager would go off the beaten path, you'd have a lot of people. So is there anything that you'd like to impart when it comes to that?
Just again to emphasize, what I said before is that if the story is working for you, that is the most important thing. And if you find yourself, nitpicking and analyzing, that just points to the fact that the story isn't working for you. And therefore you're not willing to overlook, things that, it's like, if a friend of yours has bad habits, you're willing to overlook them because they're your friend, but it would really annoy you in a stranger. And so I think that, whatever bad habits, Discovery may have, either you're connecting with it emotionally or you're not.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, and you're not going to hurt my feelings at all. So I want you to be 100% honest with me.
Okay.
How do you feel about people who are like me, who, again, I literally have watched every series more than most have, and that's saying something for a Trekkie fandom, right? And I have like, I think I went back, I have a 4-hour, when you put all of the videos together, I have like a 4-hour breakdown, and I do every episode of the Borg from TNG all the way up. And I, again, I point out any inconsistencies or when it doesn't make sense, and, go into it. How do you feel about people of my stature, or people who are like that? And you're not going to hurt my feelings. You really aren't. I'm just sincerely curious.
I think honestly, it's really similar to like academia, in which you have people that write their thesis or do, write a book on some things that to other people might seem really obscure or really obsessive, but they're really interested in the year 1850 or something like that. And so I think that, if you were doing it for a college, you would just be another academic.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm just curious because I feel like, I feel like for me, I really appreciate Star Trek more because of everything I've done into it. I see, whether it's actually there or not, I see a line from at least TNG that goes all the way into Voyager, and how things connect. And I think, again, this is, I have no illusions that this was the way that it was, but the writing and the way we see Starfleet at season 1 TNG really defines and explains how they got themselves into a war with the Dominion. I really feel like you can draw a line from point A to point B. And for me, that makes it a lot more powerful, whether it was meant to or not. So yeah, I always, because a lot of people say that it's, that I need to get a real job or something like that. So I love your take on it. See, I'm going to have you back so that we can have All right, so the only other question that I saw here, which was a super chat that I don't think we're necessarily going to go into, is, but I'm going to put it out there so you're aware of it, so you can address it if you want to, is when it comes to Booleans and waste extract. No, we're not doing that. How'd you feel about being on Jeopardy? Did you enjoy that? We don't have to talk about it.
That was so much fun. That was one of the best experiences of my life.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things. I was trying to get you to laugh. It's just my natural. I sent you an email saying I got to figure out a way to get you on Jeopardy because I saw you are very good at it from what I saw. All right. Well, hey, I do want to thank you so much for coming on. It has been just a wonderful experience. People seem to really be enjoying it. This'll go up. I
Glad.
think it. I really love your point of view, and I'm glad that I could put you on the channel because, again, when people go on YouTube, they don't really get to see someone who wrote for it and who really created the stories that they're watching. So it's good to see people who actually came from it. So I want to thank you so much, guys. I want to thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to and Farpoint Station. Before we get off, Farpoint Station, go to james@lorereloaded.com if you'd like. If you want me to refund you on the Boolean question, I will. I just don't feel it's appropriate. I'll gladly give you back the money, but I appreciate it. But guys, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. And of course, if you want to see more or you want to have Lisa come back, definitely let me know. We'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.